In the summer of 1940, the United States Army was staring at its own extinction. Across the Atlantic, Hitler's blitzkrieg had erased entire nations. Poland, Denmark, Norway, France. The Wehrmacht's Panzers were moving with a speed the world had never seen, supported by motorized infantry that struck like lightning. And in Washington, D.C., America's top generals looked at their own forces, and they were terrified. The U.S. Army was an antique, a relic from the last war. While Germany deployed mechanized divisions, America was still training cavalry regiments with horses. Its primary fast recon vehicle was the motorcycle, a machine that was useless in mud, useless in snow, and a death trap under fire. The Army had one fatal problem that was guaranteeing defeat in the next war. It had no way to move its men. It had no vehicle that could go anywhere, do anything, cross rivers, climb mountains, and survive the battlefield. The High Command knew that if America was dragged into this war, its soldiers would be slaughtered. They would be cavalry charging into machine guns. They would be motorcyclists stuck in the mud, waiting to be captured. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps did the only thing it could. It sent out an impossible request to 135 American manufacturers. The request was for a fantasy, a miracle car. The specs were insane. It had to be four-wheel drive. It had to weigh less than 300 pounds. It had to carry 600 pounds. It had to have a wheelbase of 75 inches. And it had to be delivered. A working prototype. In 49 days. The giants of the auto industry, Ford and Willys Overland, received the request. The response from their engineering departments was universal. Laughter. Then rejection. 49 days? It was impossible. It was madness. Designing a new car from a blank sheet of paper took 2 years, not 49 days. The Army's request was a joke. Ford didn't formally reply. Willys asked for an extension, admitting they couldn't meet the deadline. The system had failed. The problem was unsolvable. Companies said no, but 2 said maybe. One of them was a tiny, forgotten company in Butler, Pennsylvania, that was already dead. American Bantam was bankrupt. Its factory floor was silent. Its workforce was gone. They were a ghost, waiting for the bank to auction off the machinery. They had no money. They had no engineers. They had nothing except desperation. On July the 17th, 1940, Bantam's president, Frank Fenn, did the only thing he could. He called a freelance engineer in Detroit named Karl Probst. He begged him to come to Butler to look at the impossible government contract. Probst knew the deadline. He knew Bantam had no money to pay him. He knew the giants like Ford had already walked away. He refused. Fenn called him again. He told Probst this wasn't just a contract. This was a national emergency. Probst finally agreed, telling Fenn he would come. But he would not take the job. He would just offer advice. Karl Probst arrived in Butler on July 19th. He was 56 years old. He was an ordinary man, a brilliant but broke designer, not a corporate executive. He sat in a room with the skeleton crew of Bantam. They told him the Army needed the first blueprints in 2 days. Probst looked at the specs. 300 pounds. Four-wheel drive. He knew instantly that the 2,300-pound limit was impossible. The axles alone would weigh too much. The Army didn't know what it was asking for. This was failure. This was a fantasy. Probst told Fenn he was leaving. He was driving back to Detroit, and then he didn't. Nobody knows exactly why he stayed. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was patriotism. Maybe it was the look of desperation on the Bantam crew's faces. Karl Probst, an unemployed engineer, sat down at a drafting table in a bankrupt factory and did something that violated every rule of engineering, finance, and sanity. He took the job. He told Bantam he would work for free. For 5 straight days, Karl Probst never left the drafting room. He worked without sleep, fueled by coffee and the knowledge that the world was on fire. He was designing a car, The entire car. From his own imagination. From parts he hoped existed. He had to guess the weight of every single bolt, every bracket, every gear. He wasn't just an engineer. He was a mechanic, a designer, and an accountant all at once. And on the fifth day, he emerged. He had the complete blueprints for what would become the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, or BRC. But the blueprints, they were just paper. He had solved the problem, but only in theory. Now Bantam had to build it. They had 44 days left. A bankrupt company with a skeleton crew had to build a revolutionary, untested war machine from scratch, by hand. What happened in the next 44 days would change how every soldier in the world fought. But to understand the stakes, to understand why this stupid little car mattered, you have to understand what it was like to be a soldier before it existed. The first soldier, who died because he didn't have a Jeep, was Private William Hayes. November 1940, Louisiana Maneuvers Hayes wasn't killed by a German bullet. He was killed by an umpire's flag. The Louisiana Maneuvers were America's desperate attempt to see if its army could even fight. And it was a disaster. Hayes was a dispatch rider for the 1st Cavalry Division. His machine was the Harley-Davidson WLA. On paper, it was a fantastic motorcycle. Fast, rugged. On day 2 of the maneuvers, it rained. The fields of Louisiana turned into a thick, inescapable mud. Hayes's mission was simple. Carry a message from Division HQ to a forward regiment. A 10-mile trip. He never made it. His motorcycle, weighing over 500 pounds, sank into the mud just 2 miles outside of camp. Hayes spent an hour trying to pull it free. The engine flooded. The chain snapped. He was covered, head to toe, in mud that felt like wet cement. An umpire from the Red Force, the designated enemy, found him sitting on the side of the road, exhausted, his motorcycle a useless piece of scrap metal. The umpire tapped him on the shoulder. "You're dead, son." Hayes had failed. The communication line was broken. The regiment never got the order to retreat. 2 hours later, the entire regiment was annihilated by the Red Force's armored units. The reports from the umpires were terrifying. Generals watched as their new mechanized units, their modified civilian trucks, got stuck in ditches. They watched motorcycles fail, one after another. They watched as the only units that could actually move through the terrain were the old horse-mounted cavalry. The generals were in a cold sweat. Their men were dying in practice because their machines couldn't handle mud. Lieutenant Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower, an observer at the maneuvers, wrote a scathing report. He said the Army lacked a light, low-silhouette reconnaissance car that can go anywhere. He was describing a vehicle that did not exist. The second man to fail was Sergeant Frank Miller. Miller was in charge of a .30 caliber machine gun squad. Their transport was a modified 1939 Chevrolet truck. It was just a civilian car, painted olive green. During a night exercise, Miller's truck was ordered to move to a new defensive position on a hill. But there was no road. The driver tried to take it cross-country. They made it 50 yards. The truck's chassis, designed for paved roads, got high-centered on a log. The wheels spun uselessly. The squad spent the next 3 hours trying to dig it out. By dawn, they were still there. The umpires ruled that a single enemy, Red Force mortar team, had spotted the stuck truck and killed the entire squad. The reports piled up. Officers radioing for support that never came. Artillery pieces stuck on gravel roads. Staff cars, getting flat tires and blocking the main line of advance. The 1940 Louisiana maneuvers were not a training exercise. They were a funeral. It was the death of the old American Army. The High Command knew with chilling certainty that if they sent this army to Europe, they would be sending thousands of boys, kids like Hayes and Miller, to their deaths. They were trapped. The giants of industry had said 49 days was impossible. The maneuvers proved that without this impossible car, America could not fight. The entire fate of the U.S. Army, its ability to even compete with Hitler, now rested on a tiny, bankrupt factory in Butler, Pennsylvania. Products and a set of blueprints drawn for free by an engineer nobody had ever heard of. The clock was ticking. 44 days left. Back in Butler, Karl Probst and the Bantam factory manager, Harold Christ, began the real work. It was chaos. They had no parts. The Bantam factory was designed to build tiny civilian cars. It wasn't equipped for a rugged four-wheel drive military vehicle. They had to invent the supply chain as they went. Probst needed axles. He called Spicer Manufacturing. They told him they could design new axles in 12 weeks. Probst didn't have 12 weeks. He told them, "Don't design anything. Just use what you have. Use your standard car axles. We'll make them work." He needed a transmission. He grabbed one from a Studebaker Champion. He needed a transfer case. He called Spicer again. The Bantam factory itself became a legend in the town of Butler. The company president, Frank Fenn, put out a call. He told the town that Bantam was building a secret weapon for the army. The factory lights, which had been dark for months, suddenly burned 24 hours a day. Welders who had been laid off for 6 months showed up at the factory door, tool belts in hand. They worked for IOUs, mechanics, sheet metal workers, painters. The ghosts of Bantam all came back. This wasn't corporate manufacturing. This was a barn raising. Probst was living in the factory. He was the chief engineer, the foreman, the quality inspector. He was solving problems that Ford's massive engineering department said were unsolvable. The Army spec said 2,300 pounds. Probst knew his vehicle, with the heavy-duty axles and transfer case, would be closer to 2,000 pounds. He told Bantam, "Build it anyway. Build it strong. If it works, they won't care about the weight." He was breaking the rules again. The Bantam crew was hand-forming the sheet metal. They were welding the frame by hand. This wasn't an assembly line. This was a custom-built hot rod. The Bantam Reconnaissance Car, or BRC-40, started to take shape. It was small. It was square. It had round headlights and a flat grille. It was ugly. It looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. It was a box on wheels. As the days counted down, 30 days left, 20 days left. Panic set in. The deadline was 5 p.m., September 23rd. The delivery location was Camp Holabird in Baltimore, Maryland. That was 250 miles away by September 21st, with 48 hours to go. The car still wasn't assembled. The engine was in, but the wiring harness was wrong. The custom transfer case from Spicer had arrived, but the mounting brackets didn't fit. Probst and his team had to re-drill the frame on the factory floor. The crew was exhausted. They were making mistakes. They had worked for 40 straight days, many of them sleeping on cots next to the assembly line. On the morning of September 22nd, 36 hours to deadline, they finally started the engine. It worked. They spent the entire day test driving it around the factory yard, fixing leaks, adjusting the brakes, tightening bolts. At 4:15 p.m. on September 22nd, Harold Christ, the factory manager, and Karl Probst climbed into the driver's seat. The paint was still wet. They had less than 25 hours to drive 250 miles on an untested, handmade, impossible vehicle, to meet a deadline that the biggest companies in the world had called a joke. Probst pushed the throttle. The ugly little car rolled out of the Bantam factory. The race was on. The race was on. But this wasn't just a race against the clock. It was a race against physics. The car Karl Probst and Harold Christ were driving wasn't a production model. It was a prototype, a single, handmade collection of parts that had never been driven more than a few miles around a factory yard. And now they had to drive it 250 miles on public highways. The paint was still wet. The welds were still fresh. Every vibration from the road, every rattle from the engine was a potential disaster. What if the transmission, pulled from a Studebaker, couldn't handle the strain? What if the axles, the ones Spicer said weren't designed for this, cracked under the weight? If they broke down on the side of the road in Pennsylvania, the Bantam Company wouldn't just be bankrupt. It would be a joke, a footnote in history about the tiny company that tried to build a miracle car and failed. For 7 hours, Probst and Christ drove in almost complete silence, listening, feeling, praying. The ugly little car just kept going. It hummed past farms, through small towns. People stopped and stared. What was this thing? It looked like a child's toy, a Blitz buggy, as the Bantam mechanics had nicknamed it. They drove through the night. Then, just outside of Harrisburg, it happened. A sound. A loud clank from the front axle, followed by a violent shudder. The steering wheel tore itself from Probst's hands. The car veered hard left across the road and slammed to a stop in a ditch. It was over. They sat in the dark for a minute. Silence. The engine was still ticking. Probst got out with a flashlight. He looked under the car. His heart was pounding. He had pushed the design too hard, taken too many shortcuts. The problem? A universal joint in the steering linkage had failed. A simple 50-cent part. But they didn't have a spare. This was it. They had failed, just miles from the finish line. But Probst wasn't just an engineer. He was a mechanic. He looked at the failed part. He looked at the toolbox in the back. He found a welding torch they had packed, just in case. At 3:01 a.m. on the side of a dark highway, Karl Probst lay on his back in a muddy ditch and welded the steering joint solid. It was a terrible fix, a stupid trick. It meant the car could barely turn left, but it would drive. They climbed back in, covered in mud and grease. They limped the rest of the way to Baltimore at 4:30 p.m. on September 23, 1940, with just 30 minutes to spare. A small, ugly, mud-covered car that was half broken sputtered up to the front gate of Camp Holabird. The Army was waiting, but Bantam wasn't the only one there. Standing on the parade ground in clean suits were the engineers and executives from Ford and Willys Overland. They hadn't come to compete. They had come to watch. They had come to see the bankrupt company fail its impossible deadline. They were corporate spies, invited by the Army itself. The Army Commission, led by Colonel Howlin' Mad Smith, walked out to meet them. The officers looked at the tiny, battered car. Then they looked at Probst and Christ, covered in grease from their roadside repair. The Ford engineers were smirking. This thing was what Bantam had built? The first test was the weigh-in. The Army's impossible spec was 2,300 pounds. Probst knew he had failed this. His car, built strong, weighed in at 2,030 pounds. The Ford executive turned to the Army officer. "It's disqualified," he said. "It's 700 pounds overweight. It failed." This was the moment. The system had won. The rules were the rules. The Bantam crew, exhausted, defeated, stood and waited for the Army to send them home. But the Army officers weren't looking at the scale. They were looking at the car. It was the only car, the only company that had even tried. An officer stepped forward. He ignored the Ford executives. He looked at Karl Probst, and he said, "Start the engine." What happened next at Camp Holabird wasn't a test. It was a revelation. The Army officers, the ones who had seen their motorcycles and trucks fail in the Louisiana mud, had designed a torture chamber for vehicles. First, the mud pit. The Bantam Blitz buggy plunged in. The mud was 3 feet deep. The little engine screamed. The four-wheel drive engaged, and the car crawled its way out the other side. The officers' mouths were open. Next, the hill climb. A 60% gravel slope. No truck, no motorcycle could climb it. The Bantam car hit the base at 20 miles an hour and ran all the way to the top. The Ford engineers stopped smiling. For 30 days, the Army did everything it could to break this stupid little car. They drove it through rivers. They jumped it off loading docks. They ran it over 2x4s. They drove it, full speed, into a brick wall. The Bantam car just kept going. It was tough. It was agile. It could do everything the Army had dreamed of. Karl Probst hadn't just met the impossible specs. He had created a whole new category of vehicle. The ordinary man from the bankrupt company had won. He had saved the Army. He had saved his company. He had delivered the miracle. And then the system struck back. In Washington, the celebration was short-lived. The generals had their miracle car, but now they had a new fatal problem. They didn't just need one car. They needed hundreds of thousands of them, and American Bantam, the tiny bankrupt company that had saved them, was too small. Their factory, even running 24/7, could only build a handful of cars a day. The Army needed an industrial giant. Bantam was awarded the first small contract for 70 cars. It was a token of thanks. But the real prize, the massive war-winning contract, was still on the table, and the Army did something unbelievable. They did something that, in the civilian world, would have been called corporate theft. The Army thanked Karl Probst and American Bantam for their patriotism. And then they asked Probst for his blueprints, the blueprints he had drawn for free, the designs Bantam had paid for in blood and sweat, the soul of their miracle machine. Bantam, desperate to please the Army, handed them over. The very next day, the United States Army took Karl Probst's impossible designs and gave them to Ford and Willys Overland, the two giants who had laughed at the 49-day deadline. The message was clear. This is the car. Now copy it and make it better. This was the ultimate betrayal. The ordinary men at Bantam had proven the concept, broken the rules, and shown the way. Now the system, the corporate giants with their endless factories, were being invited to swoop in and steal the credit. The fight for the Jeep wasn't over. It had just begun. Now it wasn't a race against time. It was a race against power. Willys Overland's engineers tore Probst's design apart. They were brilliant, but they were also arrogant. They saw Probst's design, with its mix-matched parts, as amateur. They decided to build their own version. Their prototype was the Willys Quad. It looked similar, but it had one massive difference: the engine. Willys had a powerful Go Devil engine, far stronger than Bantam's. But their car was heavy, clumsy, and like Bantam's, it was massively overweight. Meanwhile, at Ford, the engineers did what Ford did best. They took the Bantam design and optimized it for mass production. Their car was the Ford Pygmy. It was lighter, and it was the first to have the flat, slotted grille that we now recognize as the Jeep face. By November 1940, the Army had 3 miracle cars: the Bantam BRC-40, the original, the one that had proven it was possible; the Willys Quad, the powerhouse, the one with the superior engine; the Ford Pygmy, the factory, the one designed to be built by the thousands. The Army now faced a choice. They had to pick one design. They lined all 3 cars up at Camp Holabird for a final brutal competition. 4,500 cars would be ordered immediately. The winner would get the contract that would define the war. The 2 losers would be forgotten. Bantam, the ordinary man who had started it all, was now the underdog. Again. They were about to go head-to-head with the 2 biggest corporations on Earth, who were using their own designs against them. The final tests began. It was Bantam versus Willys versus Ford, the fate of the Jeep, and the fate of the tiny company that had sacrificed everything. now hung in the balance. The Army's final decision, a decision that would change history, would erase two of them from history forever. The final tests at Camp Holabird were not a competition. They were an execution. The Bantam BRC-40, the original, was the lightest and most agile. It ran circles around the other two, but it was underpowered. The Ford Pygmy was the most refined. It was quiet. Its stamped metal body, designed by Ford's mass production genius, was cheap and easy to build. And the Willys Quad was a monster. Its Go Devil engine, with 60 horsepower, was a brute. It had 15 more horsepower than the Bantam or the Ford. It could pull more, climb faster, and take more punishment than anything the Army had ever seen. But the car itself was heavy, uncomfortable, and rushed. The Army Commission finished their reports. They had a fatal problem. Again. The best design was Bantam's. The best engine was Willys's. The best production body was Ford's. They couldn't pick one. Every car had a fatal flaw. Bantam was too weak. Ford was too weak. Willys was too heavy. The war in Europe was exploding. Hitler was preparing to invade Russia. The U.S. Army had no time. They couldn't go back and redesign the whole thing. So, in early 1941, the Army did something that wasn't just theft. It was genius. They decided not to pick a winner. They decided to build a Frankenstein. The Army's technical committee, led by a man named Jeep Harrington, effectively took the Bantam BRC-40, the car Karl Probst had drawn for free, tore out its weak engine, and shoved the 60-horsepower Willys Go Devil engine inside. Then, they took the best production ideas from Ford's Pygmy, like the flat, slotted grille and the easier-to-build body, and bolted them onto the Bantam Willys hybrid. This monster was the vehicle they wanted. It was the Willys Model MB. The Jeep was born. But this led to the final heartbreaking betrayal. The Army handed this Frankenstein blueprint, this perfect combination of three companies' work, to Willys Overland. They were given the first massive contract for 16,000 vehicles. And what about Bantam? The ordinary men from Butler? The bankrupt company that had answered the call when no one else would? They had lost. Their design, their 49-day miracle, was now the standard for the entire U.S. military. And another company was being paid to build it. Bantam protested. They appealed to Congress. But war doesn't wait for lawsuits. The Army needed cars, and Willys could build them. Bantam was given a consolation prize, a small contract to build 1/500 of their own BRC-40s, which were now obsolete. It was a slap in the face. Karl Probst, the engineer who had worked for free, saw his impossible car become the Willys Jeep. Soon, even Willys couldn't keep up with the demand. The Army needed millions of Jeeps. So, they turned to the only other company on Earth that could build them that fast: Ford. In a final twist of irony, the Army forced Willys to give the Frankenstein blueprints, the ones Bantam had originated, to their biggest rival, Ford. From 1941 until 1945, two companies, Willys and Ford, built over 640,000 Jeeps. And American Bantam? The ordinary men who started it all? They were given contracts to build trailers. The stupid little trailers the Jeeps would pull. They had been pushed to the sidelines, forgotten by history. Their factory went silent again after the war. This time, forever. The story of the Jeep is not a simple story of victory. It's a brutal story of innovation, sacrifice, and corporate theft. But the story of the men at Bantam was over. The story of their invention was just beginning. This is where the ugly little car stops being a tiny trick and becomes the single most important massive result of the entire war. Other stories. You'll hear about stupid wire tricks that helped a few pilots. You'll hear about fake bodies that fooled a few generals. Those stories are fascinating. This is not one of those stories. The Jeep wasn't a trick. It was the platform. It was the stage on which all other stories of the war were told. When the U.S. sent thousands of planes and tanks to Stalin to save Russia through Lend-Lease, the Russians were grateful. But the Red Army soldiers, they didn't write home about the tanks. They wrote about the Willys to the Russian soldier fighting in the frozen mud of the Eastern Front. The Jeep was a miracle. It was the only thing that could pull their artillery, the only thing that could rescue their wounded. They called it the Ivan Willys. It was their friend. In the scorching deserts of North Africa, the Jeep became a new kind of weapon. British SAS commandos, the original special forces, took these stupid little American cars, tore them apart, and mounted 50-caliber machine guns on them. They created the first fast attack vehicle. While Rommel's Panzers were waiting for fuel, these Jeeps, loaded with gas cans, would drive hundreds of miles around the German lines, appear from the empty desert, shoot up German airfields, and vanish before the Panzers even knew they were there. The Jeep wasn't just a car. It was a scalpel. On June 6, 1944, D-Day. What was the first vehicle to drive off the Higgins boats and onto the beaches of Normandy? It was the Jeep, before the tanks could land, before the trucks could move. It was the ugly little car that carried the battlefield commanders, the signal officers, and the combat medics. It was the nervous system of the entire invasion. And in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, when Hitler's Panzers made their last desperate gamble, when American soldiers were trapped, freezing in foxholes, surrounded in the snow, what was the only thing that could move? The horse was useless. The motorcycle was a joke. The 2-ton trucks were stuck on the icy roads. The only thing that could drive through the frozen forests of the Ardennes was the Jeep. They became ambulances, racing through artillery fire to rescue the wounded from Bastogne. They became heaters, with soldiers clustering around the engine block just to stay alive. They became machine gun nests, driven right to the front line to stop the German advance. There is a famous report from a captured German officer. His Panzers had been stopped by a handful of American paratroopers. He was confused. He said, "I do not understand. We cut your supply lines. We surrounded you. You had no food, no ammunition. How did you keep fighting?" The American major just pointed out the window. "We didn't need the roads. We had those. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was a lifeline." This tiny object, born from a bankrupt factory in 49 days, became the most undefeated story of the war. Why? Because it wasn't a secret. It wasn't a one-time trick. It was the opposite. It was everywhere. It was the common, ordinary, reliable workhorse that every single GI, every Brit, every Canadian, every Australian, every Russian, depended on. General George C. Marshall called it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who lived and died with the common soldiers, wrote, "It did everything. It went everywhere. It was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It consistently carried twice what it was designed for, and still kept going." And General Eisenhower, the man who had watched motorcycles fail in the Louisiana mud, gave the final verdict. He said the 3 tools that won the war for America were the C-47 transport plane, the bazooka, and the Jeep. The ordinary man, Karl Probst, never got rich. American Bantam, the company that had risked it all, vanished into history. But their stupid little car, their ugly prototype, became the machine that liberated a planet. It wasn't a silly story of a one-time trick. It was the story of the single most decisive, revolutionary, and important piece of machinery in the history of human conflict.